Hey everyone, happy Monday. Today we're looking at quantifying the American eater. And we're going back to an author we read on the very first day of the class, Jessica Mudry. At the time, we read an introduction to her book about quantifying the diet and the implications of that. Today we're reading an actually much easier article about quantifying American eaters. And we're looking at the USDA and sort of other governmental agencies in the early 1900s, 1910s who are turning food and nutrition research into numbers and into dietary advice and using that new nutrition research that's so chemically based and quantified as a form of expertise. 3 points that I hope you keep in mind as you go through the reading. The first one is the notion of quantified authority. So in the early 1900s, USDA researchers built dietary authority, their own authority, by translating food and chemical research about food into data and into quantified amounts and recommendations and so on. They're talking about calories and proteins and cost. And so everything is getting quantified. Tools like the calorimeter, which we read a lot about for Monday, I kind of want one now after all this, allow scientists to strip food down into fuel. And that's all that matters, right? Food is allows us to be productive, right? This is the early 20th century, late 19th century industrial revolution and emphasis on efficiency. We should all be doing more. We still kind of live in the shadow of this mentality. But food is allowing us to do work, right? It's not about enjoyment. It's not about anything else fun. It's about doing work and being healthy so you can do more work. And so what we're seeing in this institutional advice based on chemical research and quantification of foods and diet and health, if you don't know the chemistry, you don't have expertise. And this allows agencies like the USDA that has tremendous resources and access to chemical laboratories and equipment like calorimeters and other stuff to measure food. It allows them to have expertise and authority that no one else really can, right? Even physicians, they typically aren't doing laboratory research themselves. This kind of echoes what we saw in Cheney, right? One reason he was an expert or considered an expert, one way he played up his expertise was to talk about his knowledge of the invisible, like the iatromechanisms, the way juices would move through our body and get blocked or slowed down. He wanted to keep things moving around, right? He knew the physical mechanisms, right? Ideas about four humors and qualities. He knew about those in a way that other people didn't. It was knowledge of the invisible, in part, that gave him his expertise. And now we're seeing that same kind of thing, but now it's in the language of quantified chemical nutrition research. Point two is how the USDA really makes an effort, and this makes perfect sense, even though it's unclear if this is a really good thing to do or not, but certainly you can understand why it was seen as useful. Standardizing the eater meant using data to compare wildly different people and body types and nationalities and so on against a single standard, right? Age, gender, caloric expenditure of different kinds of jobs, right? That's what matters, right? These sort of numerical categories, actual humans and their own individual lives and bodies and temperaments and balances and so on, budgets even, doesn't matter. They all get translated into sort of comparable statistical units. And so this allows for a really different kind of advice, like more of like a population health advice that the federal government is trying to use. And this only makes sense when you can sort of standardize what different kinds of eaters are. You can't give individual advice to millions of people, right? You can give advice about statistical categories, right? So you want as few groups as possible so that you can talk to as many people as at once. But that has real consequences for sort of how applicable is any kind of advice to that group. And what happens when you don't know what group you're in or you move from one to the other? There's all kinds of weird issues that come up when you sort of quantify people into these categories. But that is the only way a government can give nutritional advice, right? You have to be very general and in a way that sort of obliterates all the individuality that we'd seen in the history of diet and health up until the mid 19th century. Point three, what do we miss when we focus on what we can measure? So notice across the readings, and the authors are really good at pointing this out, and you'll see this firsthand on Wednesday when you read our primary source. What's not there? What's not talked about in terms of dietary recommendations? Taste, culture, pleasure, tradition, fun. It's just there's no schema for that, right? It's not something you can measure. You can't use your calorimeter to tell you how good you're going to feel if you eat the chocolate cake. It doesn't work. And so it's not that these sort of qualitative aspects of food in terms of enjoyment and so on get condemned, or people say you shouldn't eat things because they taste good. I mean, Graham might say that, but no one was really saying that in the early 20th century. But they disappear from how we talk about health. Now, in the 21st century, it sounds really bizarre because we know there's such a strong correlation between mental health and food and the gut-brain axis and all this stuff that we're starting to learn more about that was clearly not on the radar of people in the 1910s and 1920s. So what constitutes a healthy diet is in a way becoming more robust. But at the time, it was really hyper-focused on the things you could measure. But this is why historical perspective is so good. You can understand what they're doing seems so bizarre to us, but when you look at the context in which they're in, it makes perfect sense. All right, your discussion post for today, the prompt should be clear enough. As usual, I'm asking you for examples from the reading. I want to know what you think. Like what resonated with you? Where were you confused? Find a place where Mudry makes a good argument. Find a good example of where a number of something becomes too simplistic or misleading or looks more certain or objective than it is. What kind of examples stand out to you? We're sticking to the mechanics today, the quantification angle. Tomorrow on Tuesday, we get into the moral angle of how quantified scientific advice becomes a proxy for a different kind of moral advice, right? Not a new phenomenon, giving moral advice about diet, but now it's couched in very different language, very different rhetoric, right? In terms of quantified nutritional research. See you next time.